Digital communication has transformed society, whether that's work or dating or socializing. Virtually everything we do now goes over the internet. But for as many privacy and security problems as we have now, none of that would be possible if we had no way to protect our information as it moves through the network, or when it's stored on the various servers that enable services like iMessage or WhatsApp. Until the 1990s, U.S. federal regulations made this nearly impossible. Protecting information requires encryption. That is to say, using cryptography, a form of math that lets us make guarantees about things like who can read a message, or who wrote it, or whether it's been modified. Cryptography is the branch of math that lets us share our confidential information in a world full of bad guys. And that's our world. Our privacy is under constant attack. It's under attack by greedy corporations that want to mine and resell our data without our knowledge or consent. It's under attack by hackers who want to hold our data for ransom or use it to steal our identities. It's under attack by governments that want to use the surveillance power of modern technology to keep an eye on their citizens every minute of every hour of every day, everywhere they go. Today, the federal government is contemplating passing the Earn It Act, a law that would seriously jeopardize the ability of any tech platform operating in the U.S. to use cryptography to protect user privacy from any of these threats. To understand how the Earn It Act works and why the government is seeking it, let's start by looking at how cryptography has been regulated in the past. During the Cold War, the United States tried to keep a very tight lid on cryptography. Certain Allied countries during World War II, including the United States and United Kingdom, maintained a strong lead in both the making and breaking of ciphers. This allowed their militaries and government officials to exchange secret information while reading the secret messages of their enemies. So to protect this advantage in war making, the United States government regulated cryptography as munitions. This meant that anyone making products that encrypted information needed to register with the government as arms dealers if these products were to be sold overseas. Initially, this was not especially relevant to most people's everyday lives. In a world where communication generally went by mail, this was not such a big deal. But by the 1990s, people were using personal computers to share all kinds of information all over the world. Because anything published on the internet was effectively exported across the globe, the U.S. government insisted that any software published by U.S. developers online was subject to these arms control laws. When Phil Zimmermann released Pretty Good Privacy, which allowed people to encrypt messages like email in a way that could not easily be broken, the federal government threatened him with criminal charges. As the internet developed, this policy created massive problems. After all, if people can't secure information as it moves across the internet, they can't secure their banking information. They can't do online transactions. They can't email about confidential corporate or even government secrets to the extent that the government had to rely on off-the-shelf technology. At first, the government sought to solve this by limiting the strength of cryptography. The State Department declared that certain very weak encryption schemes would be allowed for export without special license. Unfortunately, even in the 1990s, these encryption schemes could be broken, even by agencies outside of the government. In 1995, then graduate student cryptographer Daniel J. Bernstein requested permission from the State Department to publish a math paper and associated source code for a strong encryption system he had developed called Snuffle. The federal government refused to allow Bernstein to export his algorithm, either as source code or as a paper. They claimed that even disclosing the mathematics behind strong cryptography would count as exporting munitions under the arms export rules. Bernstein therefore filed a lawsuit in federal court claiming that his First Amendment right to free speech was being restricted. As a result, the Ninth Circuit Court ruled that source code is covered by the First Amendment as speech. Possibly to avoid a follow-up ruling that might restrict their future ability to regulate cryptography, the government soon dropped cryptography from the munitions list, thereby permitting it for international export without a license. This began the modern era of cryptography policy, in which researchers and software developers have been free to develop strong encryption and release it for use to the general public around the world. This is very important because it turns out there are really only two kinds of cryptography. Strong cryptography, which can guarantee that attackers cannot read, forge, or modify encrypted data without the key, and weak cryptography, which cannot. Practically speaking, there is no middle ground. There is no practical way to make algorithms that can only be broken by the right people. Only strong cryptography can control access to information. In a world where everything happens over the internet, controlled access to information is imperative. If you, as a user, do not have the right to control who can read your information or send messages on your behalf, then you have very few rights in the digital world at all. Since the 1990s, the federal government has sought to weaken public cryptography. Since anyone can encrypt anything, they say, terrorists and sex traffickers and drug cartels are able to escape justice by hiding their communications. Thus, says the government, they need the ability to snoop. The government has sought to attain this power in a variety of ways. One approach has been to push what are known as key escrow schemes. With key escrow, the key is held either by the service provider themselves or a third party, and then released to the government when certain conditions are met, like the presentation of a warrant. The problem with this scheme is that anyone who gets access to this key also gets access to all the data encrypted with it, whether they were legally entitled to or not. Also, because the government can and does routinely lie to obtain warrants and order companies to disclose things even without a warrant, that it can easily persecute political enemies. For instance, the FBI illegally infiltrated the civil rights movement and conducted 24-hour surveillance on Martin Luther King with the intent of undermining his political influence. And NSA illegally monitored the phone calls and text messages of millions of Americans from 2001 to 2007. Today, NSA claims that they're not doing that anymore. But we have no way to verify that. And, in fact, during the time that we know NSA was doing this, their director, James Clapper, went before Congress and testified under oath that his agency wasn't doing that.
So what I wanted to see is if you could give me a yes or no answer to the question, does the NSA collect any type of data at all on millions or hundreds of millions of Americans?
No, sir.
It does not.
Not wittingly. There are cases where they could inadvertently, perhaps, collect, but not wittingly.
All right.
This makes it extremely difficult to trust that NSA will be honest about how it uses key escrow in the future. Key escrow also allows tech platforms themselves access to your data. While this is generally already the case today, more and more tech companies are adopting what's known as end-to-end encryption. With end-to-end encryption, your data is stored encrypted, and the platform never has a copy of the key. When implemented correctly, this prevents platforms from ever having access to your data. This ensures that not only can the platform not abuse your data by reselling it to others, it also can't be stolen in a leak. However, if the platform is allowed to have a copy of the key, then that key can be stolen along with the data. Thus, key escrow schemes perpetuate the same problem that we have with unencrypted data. Hackers can break in and steal the sensitive information of millions of people. Another scheme that the federal government has attempted is to develop defective algorithms and use espionage tactics to drive their adoption. For instance, we know from the Edward Snowden disclosures that NSA developed a backdoored random number generator known as dual EC-DRBG. Because encryption keys are really just really big random numbers, the NSA's idea was to drive adoption of a defective random number generator, something that looked like it was putting out actually random bits, but in fact was actually done in such a way that the NSA could recover the keys. This way, they could decrypt encrypted data themselves without even needing to go to a court for a warrant or letting the tech platforms know that they were accessing their users' data. Despite the fact that cryptographers quickly spotted the high likelihood that these algorithms contained a backdoor, NSA was able to use its relationship with various standards-making bodies and cybersecurity firms to drive adoption of its not-so-random number generator. This included paying a $10 million bribe to major cybersecurity firm RSA Security to set dual EC DRBG as its default random number generator in its products. RSA and NSA apologized for this brazen attack on public safety with this stirring apology. Whoops, my mistake. NSA and RSA never apologized for doing that. Instead, NSA's director of research had this to say. With hindsight, NSA should have ceased supporting the dual EC DRBG algorithm immediately after security researchers discovered the potential for a trapdoor. In truth, I could think of no better way to describe our failure to drop support for the dual EC DRBG algorithm as anything other than regrettable. In other words, NSA pushed forward even after they got caught, and they really regret that. Schemes like this are even worse than key escrow because in addition to being installed through an elaborate series of lies and treachery, they place a sort of master key at the heart of all cryptography. Anyone who knows the master key gets to break everything, and there's no way to retroactively change the key once it is leaked. If the Russian or Chinese governments get access to that key, they get to decrypt everything as well, and there's nothing we can do to stop it. By the way, we know that NSA did all this because Edward Snowden leaked gigabytes of highly confidential information, which demonstrates why we should probably not rely too much on the federal government's ability to keep a secret. Even worse for the government, officials feel that the revelation of these attacks has driven the public to adopt even more encryption. As former FBI Director James Comey put it, there has always been a corner of the room that was dark. That was where sophisticated actors like nation-states operated. But what's happened since Snowden is that more and more of the room is dark. It's not just sophisticated actors. This has left the government feeling cornered. It can't ban the public use of cryptography because on some level, it's necessary to protect the marketplace on which its tax revenue depends. Besides which, it can't even really regulate it because of constitutional concerns. No one trusts compromise solutions like key escrow or backdoors because these undermine the entire purpose of cryptography. This brings us to the federal government's latest attack on consumer cryptography, the Eliminating Abusive and Rampant Neglect of Interactive Technologies Act of 2022, or the EARN IT Act. This is perhaps the government's most brilliantly conceived attack to date. EARN IT bans the use of strong cryptography without actually mentioning cryptography at all, except in a paragraph that, at first glance, reads like it is protecting the use of cryptography. Instead, EARN IT relies on the United States' terrifying system of civil liability to create a legal minefield that is virtually guaranteed to destroy any company stupid enough to use end-to-end encryption after its passage. Here's how it works. Obviously, online services let you see information from other people. Services like YouTube aren't liable for the content that they host. This is because of a clause in United States law known as Section 230 of Title 47 of United States Code. This provides that site owners are not liable for the content on their sites as long as they take reasonable efforts to remove illegal material once they are made aware of it. EARN IT modifies Section 230 to make it easy for courts to find platform owners liable for CSAM, child sexual abuse material, even if the site owner did not know that the material was on there at the time. EARN IT doesn't actually specify the conditions under which that might happen. It just opens the door for the federal government or any of the 50 states to pass laws or make findings in court that hold these companies liable. All any of them have to do is pass a law that holds tech companies liable for negligently allowing the exploitation of children in some way, such as by allowing the transmission of sexually explicit photos of children or allowing abusers a means to contact children and groom them for abuse. To be clear, these activities are already highly illegal, and platform owners like Facebook or Twitter or Apple already have to take action when they are made aware of them. However, EARN IT takes this a gigantic step further. Platform owners would be liable for the mere fact that this activity could take place. They would be exposed to liability if they didn't take enough action to stop people from doing this to begin with. If people are using end-to-end encryption, those platforms have no way of knowing what is taking place, and this could be used to demonstrate that they were negligent, that they had not done enough to mitigate the risk of child exploitation. Now, how could we determine what negligence is? Most states provide a definition like negligence is when you have a duty to perceive the danger of some action and then don't do the things a reasonable person would do to avert that danger. EarnIt identifies the danger quite clearly, the sexual abuse of children. But what should a reasonable person do to avert such a thing, assuming that person were making decisions at a tech company? To answer this, EarnIt creates a National Commission on Online Child Sexual Exploitation Prevention, staffed with 19 bipartisan political appointees. Its job is to define best practices for tech companies to follow to attack the problem of child exploitation. This commission would be led by the Attorney General, a post appointed by the President. Now, every Attorney General has their own policy objectives. One thing that is broadly agreed upon by Attorney Generals from both Republican and Democrat presidents is the desire to clamp down on the public use of strong cryptography. We have seen statements from Eric Holder and Loretta Lynch, who served under Barack Obama, as well as from Jeff Sessions and William Barr, who served under Donald Trump, all of whom opposed the use of strong encryption by the general public. Each of them claimed it was imperative that we compromise the general public's ability to encrypt data in order to expand law enforcement's power. EarnIt does not directly require companies to follow the Commission's recommendations. But when considering what measures a reasonable person might take to avert the danger of child abuse, courts are likely to place a lot of weight on the best practices recommended by a federal government commission. EarnIt goes so far as to say that end-to-end encryption is not, on its own, enough to create liability. At first glance, that language seems very reassuring. It makes it sound like the EarnIt Act will not be an attack on the use of end-to-end cryptography. But a more careful read reveals that it actually provides no protection whatsoever. As the Electronic Frontier Foundation points out, the current language merely says that the use of strong encryption shall not serve as an independent basis for liability, but emphasizes that courts can consider otherwise admissible evidence of encryption as evidence of the provider's liability. On top of this, there is nothing within the language of EarnIt that forbids the commission it creates from forbidding the use of strong encryption as part of its best practices. The genius of EarnIt is that instead of banning the use of strong cryptography by the general public, it simply creates a vast legal minefield for any company that would provide it. Instead of enumerating the specific things the company must do, EarnIt creates a brutal compliance labyrinth in which companies must imagine what courts might do in the face of ever-changing state or federal regulation and limit their liability accordingly. This creates what is known as a chilling effect, the use of vague law to restrict what is otherwise completely lawful conduct. If the government said companies cannot encrypt user data, then there would be the risk that the Supreme Court would find this unconstitutional. But if the government simply withdraws protections and creates a legal environment where it is extremely difficult for companies that encrypt to defend themselves from charges of enabling child exploitation, then it accomplishes the same end without nearly the constitutional risk. We've already seen this happen before. Congress used the same tactic of partially withdrawing Section 230 protection in 2018 with FOSTA SESTA. As a result, tech companies instantaneously became extremely reluctant to allow any kind of adult material. For instance, following the passage of FOSTA SESTA, the once popular microblogging platform Tumblr collapsed. Even the proposal of EarnIt has created a chilling effect. EarnIt was first proposed in 2020. Although it did not pass, Apple is clearly worried about its future liability in the U.S. or any other jurisdiction that passes similar legislation. In 2021, Apple announced that it would have its devices scan every photo before being uploaded to iCloud. Apple has temporarily backed down from this idea, but they have made it known that they intend to bring this out in the future. Now you might ask, isn't it worth it to keep the children safe? And the answer is no, it definitely isn't. Enabling bulk warrantless surveillance doesn't keep anybody safe, and it definitely doesn't stop child abusers. It's almost completely irrelevant to this problem. As we see over and over again, sexual abuse, including the sexual abuse of children, often goes unpunished, even when law enforcement is completely aware of the problem, even when full and complete and convincing evidence of the abuse is presented. Abusers still escape justice. Why? Because the justice system lacks the will to prosecute the offenders that it knows full well about. When abusers are powerful, as were the associates of Jeffrey Epstein, they will escape justice. When the abused are powerless, as is the case with however many tens or hundreds, maybe even millions of impoverished children who are exposed to sexual abuse just to survive, the system has no interest in protecting them. The state cannot possibly use these tools for good when it consistently fails to use the tools that it already has. Compromising public safety will not protect these people. If the supporters of the Earn It Act are sincere in their desire to address child sexual abuse, they should not take aim at the technologies that protect the ability of victims to communicate privately without the knowledge of their abusers. Instead, they should work on fixing the system that consistently protects those abusers. Such an effort is unlikely to result in additional surveillance powers. However, it would result in many, many lives saved. It's difficult to even imagine that the Earn It Act would meaningfully restrain the ability of pedophiles to communicate in a secure, encrypted manner. Child abusers have the ability to conduct their operations on the dark web or on small private services either unknown to the government or located outside of its jurisdiction. The general public, on the other hand, has no such ability to move their everyday lives. So it's not exactly a shock that organizations that protect civil liberties like the EFF or the ACLU vehemently oppose the Earn It Act. The United States is not the only place looking at this kind of legislation. Jurisdictions like the United Kingdom, Australia, and the European Union all have legislation either pending or on the books that uses child sexual abuse as a pretext to limit public privacy. However, no version of any legislation can possibly target pedophiles in the way that it targets the general public, because the cat is out of the bag. The cryptography algorithms are already well known, they are published, they are peer-reviewed, the source code is out there. The bad guys are always going to have the ability to use strong cryptography. The only question is whether or not you or I get access to that same technology within the platforms that we use every day. Policymakers remain in a decades-long process of denial about this. That's why we see insane quotes like this one from Malcolm Turnbull, the former Prime Minister of Australia, discussing, again, legislation that severely limited the public's access to strong cryptography. The laws of mathematics are very commendable, but the only law that applies in Australia is the law of Australia. Until policymakers learn that they cannot make 1 + 1 = 3 on the strength of their political needs alone, we will continue to see bad legislation that fails to accomplish any of its stated goals. Thanks for watching. This has been an episode of Cypher Suite. My name's Jonas. If you enjoyed this episode, please go ahead and leave a like, comment, subscribe. That'll make sure that you stay informed when we post new content. It'll also make sure that our channel grows. We really appreciate your time. Thank you very much.